Ever wonder what a seal is thinking as it dodges boat traffic in New York Harbor? Or why a mean sea otter stealing surfboards isn't really mean at all? In this episode, marine mammal cognition expert Dr. Kevin Wu takes us into the minds of seals and sea lions, how they perceive, how they decide, and how they adapt to a city that never stops moving. It's animal cognition meets urban survival. You're listening to Wild Connection, where every conversation is a journey into what it means to be part of this wild and complicated world. I'm your host, Dr. Jen, and I talk with scientists, authors, and changemakers about people, nature, and the surprising connections that tie us all together. Welcome back, everybody, to Wild Connection. Today's guest is Dr. Kevin Wu, co-director of the Center for the Study of Pinniped Ecology and Cognition, or CSPEC, a professor at SUNY Empire State University, and, full disclosure, my boss. He studies the minds of seals and sea lions, running cognitive research at the Long Island Aquarium, while also tracking harbor seals hauling out right in New York Harbor. In this episode, we talk about what cognition means for other animals, how seals may be teaching each other which spots in the city are safe, and why their return to New York's waterways might be a sign that the harbor itself is recovering. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited because I was supposed to have you on the podcast a couple of years ago. And so this has been a long time coming. And I've now also gotten to know you more professionally. And one of the things I like to always ask guests at the start is, how did you end up here? What was, what drew you to studying the minds of marine mammals?
No, that's a good question. I often consider myself a bit of a late bloomer. I grew up in New York City. My parents weren't nature people. So I did not have, I think, the kind of upbringing I think most people would imagine, like, a field scientist to start would have. That'd be sort of running wild in all the corners of the world, getting dirty and stuff. And so that part never really happened. And so, and then as a high school student, I don't tell my own kids, but I tell other people that I was a rather mediocre science and math student. Like, it wasn't my forte. Somewhere in my undergraduate years, it clicked, right? I think everybody has these moments where they click. And I went to Southampton College, which was part of the Long Island University system. And I remember sitting in like intro chemistry, intro physics, where it was an absolute disaster in high school. And somewhere along the line, it just clicked. Part of it, I think, was I was at a small liberal arts institution, and our class sizes were really small. And I said, I'm going to be rather bold. And when I don't know anything, I'm really going to ask for help. And I think that's a difficult thing for a lot of people to do, especially when they're younger. But I think it enabled me to be more confident in not just asking for help, but speaking up, I think, in general for myself, which is also really important, right? And I think in the sciences in general. So somewhere in my undergraduate years, it went from going to school simply to earn a degree, and that was my life in high school, and then going to school to learn. And then when I hit those, I think, critical moments in people's degrees, that is, a few months before one finishes, you have a little bit of a panic. It's either like, what am I going to do, right? Am I going to continue to study, that is, continue to learn? Am I going to, go out into the real world and get a job, and that was probably the most frightening prospect. And so I think at the time, at those iterations, I was very keen on continuing to learn. And I ended up with a degree in psychobiology from Southampton, but my interests then at the time were pivoting towards ecology and conservation. And so I ended up doing my master's in ecology and biodiversity at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And I think I was choosing my degrees also then based on location as opposed to the actual degree itself. But I think that's a big part of it too. All right. I mean, I actually do encourage a lot of my students while following an academic path is nice, there's a really big social component. There's a really big personal component, right? How do you work on yourself, right? I think a lot of students just really sort of fall through the cracks because they believe that the mission is to be the world's best scientist, and they should strive to that. But at some time, self-care is really important, right? So like they got to take care of themselves. You're no good as a scientist. You can't take care of yourself. And and then I again I just started getting better, I think, at understanding experimental design. Ecology was new to me, transitioning from undergrad to grad. And I sometimes felt as a grad student as well, I was just trying to keep my head above water because I was entering something that I was unfamiliar with. But part of it too is sort of putting your head down and grinding through a little bit. But I was thankful to be in a cohort of folks who we all helped each other like for different projects and stuff like that. So there I was gravitating back, I think, towards behavior in general. And I devised my initial master's project was to look at psychophysics in marine mammals. I was trying to work with a local organization there. It fell apart horribly again. But these are one of these sort of trials that again, how do you battle through it, right? So I remember thinking at the time, like, that's it. My entire project, my entire master's was going to be crippled because things fell apart so badly. And then I managed to end up looking at sensory perception in tuatara, which is sort of a treasured species in New Zealand. Um, I also have this story, which I have a lot of stories, so I probably won't tell them all, but just quickly, there was one time when I was working in the lab and one of them chomped down on my thumb, and I came very close to knocking off a treasured treasured individual if it wasn't for the fact that I could easily use my other hand to reach the phone and call for help. But so then I went from my master's and I was at Macquarie University and I did my PhD in animal behavior. And this, I think, was the time where I really got to bridge together the field interest, the interest in psychophysics, sensory perception, and cognition. And, I think all under the umbrella of animal behavior communication. I became better. I don't want to say it became great, but it can get better. Also, at working in a laboratory environment, thinking about questions that can be answered in the environment, utilizing at the time new techniques and tools. A good part of my PhD employed computer generated animations to study signaling, visual signaling. So that was really, really cool stuff. Again, things that I did not have any experience with and had to learn. And I enjoyed that kind of learning. And then to go to conferences and then to meet people who were interested in the work and make connections. It was, it really sort of paints a more holistic picture why I continued to do what I do. But getting back to the original question about how did I get into marine mammals? So it was something that I always wanted to study ever since I was an undergrad. My advisor, Paul Forstell, at the time, he was a marine mammal guy, and it just there is something about charismatic megafauna that's just darn attractive, right? And coming to SUNY Empire allowed me to kind of come full circle in that they were really supportive in allowing me to select what I wanted to study and the questions I wanted to study. So I connected with Dr. Christy Buolsi, a good friend and colleague now at Marist University. And May 19th, 20, I want to say, what is it now? 2014, I think it was. It's my niece's birthday. Not she was born, but she was born on yeah, in May on that day. But and we sort of came together and we had these interests again, both in questions in the field, questions in the lab. In particular, a lot of our field work is in New York City, and we were just really surprised that very little was being done at that time. So it was almost ripe for us to kind of get into it. So I had the institutional support, I had Christie's support, um, and it allowed me to kind of get back into the things that I was really interested in. And so that's a very cool place to be, right? Because a lot of students, I don't think they can see again what the projection is in their own career. You asked me 10 years ago, I probably had no idea I'd be doing what I'd be doing now at all. And sometimes I just have to wake up in the morning and go, wow, that's pretty cool. Like it's actually pretty cool.
Yeah.
Like, so yeah.
Yeah, well, so what's really fascinating for me is thank you first for sharing that story and your path, because there's a lot of places where even my path intersects in similar ways. I I don't tell a lot of people this, but I dropped out of high school at
Mm,
16 and got a GED because I wanted to go to college. And I would say that the initial years at community college were a struggle because I
mm,
hadn't learned how to learn.
mhm,
And it clicked for me, science clicked for me because of a particular professor, Dr. Colombo. And
mm.
we still keep in touch
Nice.
today. And I realized I was good at science, like, and it was because he believed in me and he was a fish biologist. And at the time, I was very passionate about primates, and I'd read all the Jane Goodall books and the Diane Fossey books, um, and then some other books by field researchers. I hadn't known there was a thing called PhD in animal behavior.
Mm, yep.
I
Yep.
just was trying to figure out how do I spend time with animals, and
Hmm.
veterinary school was not it, zoo was not
Hmm.
it, and so I read these books and all these people had PhDs and I'm like, okay, that's just what I have to do. I go, I get that, and then I will have the ability to do the same things. And I also got my bachelor's in psychobiology.
Oh,
I
nice. Hmm. Hmm.
did. And when I went to get my master's, I did not end up with primates. I ended up with prairie dogs. And
Hmm.
I felt like the same thing, keeping my head above water, trying to understand courses I had never taken before, evolution, ecology, and learning about research design and designing my first project, of which then half of my colonies that I was studying were poisoned,
Oh
which was
no.
a total
Okay.
disaster, and
Yeah.
I thought the
Yeah.
same thing.
Hmm.
And ultimately, I ended up at Stony Brook and with Charlie Jansen, who studied capuchins. And it was really because I badgered him for about 2 years. I would call him every 3 months and just say, hi, I'm still interested. I want to come and work with you. And
Hmm.
my ultimate goal was to study mountain gorillas. And it took a really long time. And now I do. And
Hmm.
I did fall in love with prairie dogs, even though they are not
Hmm.
megafauna, but they are pretty darn charismatic. So
Yeah, there you go. One
um,
out of two criteria there. So
that's right. And it was
yeah.
in my PhD also that I started concentrating on animal behavior and
Yeah.
that relationship to how animals are making decisions and finding their way in the world. And more recently, I've been thinking about not how sociality evolves, but social life, how animals navigate their relationships and cooperation and competition.
Hmm.
Cognition kind of keeps coming up,
Hmm.
this underlying thread, but it's also one of those words that sounds kind of clinical. And so what do people really think of? What is cognition when you're thinking about research on something like seals? What does that mean?
Yeah, sure. So I like to think of it in kind of two levels, right? This sort of, and not to say, I'm just going to say this too. I'm going to dispel that any of this stuff that I'm going to say, someone might say, well, what does it have to do with things like intelligence or so on, which is a whole nother conversation. And I know we can certainly touch on that today, but, and students love that too, right? We have conversation about this. That's where they immediately want to jump to. But so when I say this in sort of two camps, it's sort of like a lower level and higher order, sort of like, cognitive ability. And, for me, sort of lower order things are simply how, how do animals discern their environment? Right. And that's a loaded question in itself, right? But we can sort of titrate it out to little things like how do they discern visual information, auditory information, and so on. And then higher order cognitive stuff becomes an integration of discerning that information and then responding to it, right? So once you have this information, what do you do with it or how do you react to it? And that then gives an indication of sort of processing, right? That the individual is taking all this information, trying to make sense of it, and then doing something about it, right? So to speak. So a lot of I think what we do is a little bit of both, mostly because I'm somewhat of a reductionist when it comes to answering scientific questions. I like to sort of start from the beginning and then kind of add on layer by layer until it gets to the point where we can look at more complex interactions. When you look at a lot more higher order cognitive studies, they're going right there. They're looking for these sort of interactions. So I think about stuff like multimodal signaling, right? A visual signal and an auditory signal. And you can combine them both, which is a lot of times why they've evolved to be so successful. But there are aspects of each one individually that are still important. So how do we test each one of those pieces, right? So that's the way I think about sort of the levels of cognition, if you will. And then what we do in conjunction with the Long Island Aquarium. And we're very lucky, by the way, to work with the crew there. They're fantastic. And they're also very interested, right, in the research and the work. We are doing, again, the sensory things. We're doing things like object transfer, and we're trying to test for sort of intuition, like can they predict or an inference? Can they predict, things that are going to happen next, patterns, and so on? So, I think of cognition as sort of a combination, if you will, of sort of the low and the higher order stuff. But we only begin to understand it if we can sort of ask the right questions and develop the right assays to allow animals to tell us about what they're thinking and their sensory worlds, right? So,
Yeah. Well, can you give me an example? This is really fascinating because, of course, I think the majority of people believe that animals are thinking at some level, right?
mhm,
And I like the way you break that up between, okay, I'm taking in information. We're doing the same thing. We're taking in visual information, auditory information, and we are trying to make sense of the world and then decide what we do in
mhm,
response. And sometimes we get it horribly wrong. And so do
mhm,
other animals. I've actually seen and experienced a incorrect conclusion based on
mhm,
information that was just misunderstood, I guess.
mhm. Yeah.
The only way I know how to say it. And fortunately for us humans in that situation, the individual realized they were incorrect
Mhm,
and stopped their potential assault on us
mhm,
as punishment for what they
mhm,
thought we might have done. So that was great. I really appreciated the reprocessing
mhm,
and so can you give us like an example like of one behavior in seals that kind of when you say object permanence, what does this mean and how
mhm.
does that relate to how they're thinking about the world and making decisions?
Sure. So I think I'll answer this by telling you a bit about our grand plans, if you will, of things that we'd like to do. That is Christy and I. And I sort of jokingly say it's a sort of 3 to 5 year plan. I said this again 5 years ago. I probably said it 5 years before that. Um, Much in the way that, even though we sort of tackle these questions, and as a scientist, we're like the worst people to go for answers because we have more questions. So we keep asking more questions about more questions, right? So we're very much interested in bridging how these individuals, again, see elements of their natural world. So whether it's, above sea level, like they're hauled out on a rock, they're communicating with each other, or they're trying to sense things like threat and danger, threat from predation or anthropogenic things like people, boats, and that kind of stuff. Which we know they have to negotiate in the wild. But then how do we quantify that? How do we get that kind of data a little more systematically? And that's where I think we can pair up what we are doing, what we plan to do at the Long Island Aquarium, is to begin to sort of tap into those abilities to generalize or discriminate between, again, mostly right now, visual and auditory stimuli. And the other dimension, of course, that I just said we're looking at sort of above sea level, but then there's the whole sort of underwater aspect, right? How do they also utilize these modalities underwater and discern the differences and so on? So, even things like underwater navigation. I again say that quite loosely, as you know, because navigation is in itself a whole nother, topic of conversation. But yes, they have to have some ability to negotiate underwater topography. They have to have some ability to navigate hundreds of miles seasonally, right? So there is an integration of those things. There is the ability to think, well, to see, to think, to decide, right, about how and where they're going to go. And we don't tag any of the wild animals, just an FYI, that is not in our cards. We know people that do, but that's not something that we do. So then how do we go back to utilizing the animals that we can work with in the Long Island Aquarium? And I have to remind myself the vernacular now is maintained under human care. It was sort of old school every time I want to say in captivity. Um, but that is becoming unfavorable here, so I have to take a pause and say maintained in human care, under human care, so on, and that is just fine by me, and probably more appropriate too. So in the Long Island Aquarium, we work with both seals, primarily harbor seals, as well as sea lions, and we do a very kind of classic cognitive test, and it can be used again for testing kind of basic decision making, as well as sort of looking at sensory perception. So it's called match to sample, right? And you can do what is called a delay match to sample, which kind of spreads out the time. So we're thinking about, acquisition, which is first, how do you acquire or understand the task, to looking at learning, to looking at memory, like long-term memory and so on. The match to sample, or MTS, sort of method is pretty common and it's pretty standard, but again, very useful. And it starts off with sort of a two-choice kind of discrimination task, right? And or again, generalization. So if you have trained your animal to look at a particular stimulus, and then you give it to others to choose from, either you want it to be similar, dissimilar, we basically train them to respond, and if they're able to see or hear the characteristics that we want them to decipher, they get rewarded. It's positive reinforcement, and we begin to titrate that stuff out. So in terms of, some of the sort of object permanence, transfer and stuff that we're doing at the Long Island Aquarium. So we're doing things to look at depth perception, and also texture contour. So going from things like photographs to live objects. We have been testing for and looking at sort of sensory thresholds, so trying to titrate out objects in color, to sort of larger, smaller sizes, to deeper or darker colors and hues. And this is all, again, also a way for us to be able to test these animals without being invasive. And there are labs that are doing other kinds of sensory work that give us, I think, other kinds of quantifiable data. There's a lab in Germany, Frederica Henke as well. She's doing quite a lot of stuff too. If you, if I guess I'm going to sort of just sort of give her a quick plug here, but if you ever sort of stalk her and look at her work, they've got all these sort of cool gizmos. They basically the sort of like seal helmets, if you will. Uh, they're pretty cool stuff. So the idea, anyways, is to kind of move from some of those visual information that we are now getting a better handle of. So if they're able to see things like certain shapes and colors above water, right? Can we do the same tests underwater? We are looking to utilize technology as well, so that right now our apparatuses are very manual. So we have to flip a screen up, and we have to so when we reinforce them, we're doing it by hand. But how can we begin to automate stuff? So things like touchscreen as well, and that also and when we get to things like touchscreen and digital imagery, then we can also utilize, I think, more complex stimuli as well. And we want to get to a point where we move from things that we know are distinctly artificial, um, but they ought to be distinct, right? Not just for us as researchers, but we were trying to make it obvious for them. Can you tell the difference between these? To getting it to more naturalistic kind of stimuli, predators, prey, for example, right? Other conspecifics, right? These are the stimuli that we want to eventually test them on as well, being able to recognize and what aspects to recognize as well. Eventually, we also, again, want to couple that with, auditory stimuli too. We, we are interested in trying to understand how they can decipher conspecific communication, particularly in noisy environments. Our study population in New York City obviously deals with a lot of commercial and recreational boat traffic. And, if you ever, and you could pull some of this too. If you ever drop a hydrophone in the middle of New York Harbor, it's loud, right? It's just very loud, yet it's important that these animals successfully communicate. So we want to be able to also conduct some tests where we look at the vocal signatures of these animals, begin masking them perhaps again, and seeing again if they're still able, right, to decipher these sort of communicative signals, right, and this is sort of, again, those foundational pieces that once we have an understanding that they can discriminate perceptually between important and, say, irrelevant kind of environmental noise, the greater implications are understanding how it's applied in the wild, right? So we can replicate those kinds of sounds in the laboratory, and then test it in the laboratory, and then make inferences about the choices that they're making in the wild, right? Okay, there's a large commercial vessel coming by, yet, it might be an opportunity to feed, right? Are they going to make a choice of being in the water, trying to communicate with each other, trying to have to overcome these sort of issues with communication, but then perhaps at a very minimalist perspective, that it's still, the trade-off is still important enough to feed and deal with all these challenges. The long-term goal for what we want to do, and this was really one of the main reasons why we started CSpec, was to understand how animals dealt with the anthropogenic challenges. We have data that uh, has said this, the seasonal populations are pretty stable. And we've had that data for going on 10, 15 years. But we want to better understand those challenges, right? We know that they are dealing with them, but we don't know how they're dealing with them, right? And it's just like we were talking about earlier about sort of background noise, for example, and whether us as humans can kind of filter out the things that might distract us so that we can continue to be productive. But for these animals, it's not just productivity, it's survival, right? Like they are choosing to be in these locations that are very noisy, that are very busy. They're trying to make decisions about how to overcome these things. And then they're choosing to come back seasonally, which again gives an inference that they are dealing with them, but we want to understand how. And then possibly why, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, and so what that, that really is saying, also is that all these other animals, they're not passive creatures that are just reacting to their environment. They're evaluating and they're making decisions about where to go, when to move, who to follow, when to take
mhm,
risk. And
mhm,
now they're really doing that more, as you pointed out, in landscapes that we've taken over. And
mhm,
just to kind of orient listeners, you've studied seals in New York Harbor, not
mhm,
just in the aquarium. And for most people, New York Harbor doesn't seem to be a place that they'd picture finding a seal. And
mhm,
you mentioned how it's really noisy there for them and that they're having to deal with all these things to get through the day. And I know research on birds is showing that different species have different ways of coping with human caused noise or anthropogenic noise. And some scream like the nightingales, they just scream louder.
mhm,
Others are changing the time of day that they're singing to try to cut through that noise. And energetically, these things can also impact,
mhm,
you know, other species. And so you mentioned haul out. And so what is a typical, first of all, what is hauling out? Why do
mhm,
seals do it? And
mhm.
in New York Harbor, what does a typical haul out site look like with all the human activity around them?
Yeah, and I also want to say too that the research on changing signaling and the urban environment, there's also some, not a lot, because we're talking about sort of cultural evolution, right? How to change your behavior faster than natural selection, but some are trying to utilize, right? Some species are trying to utilize the urban environment to their advantage. Like, can we reverberate, right? Auditory calls off of large buildings and so on, right? So there's actually some really really cool stuff that people are doing, but again, and thinking about sort of these are selected species that have managed to adapt quite nicely and have to continue to adapt, right, to sort of an artificial and changing environment. But for our haul outs in New York City, these are essentially locations where animals are coming out to rest for sort of longer periods of time. Most places in the world, seals will often haul out at low tide because the topography is just more accessible. Like there's just more land. There are a few places, for example, Little Egg Harbor, which is in South Jersey, where it's the opposite. They come out to haul out in high tide because that's the only way they can access some of these places. So it's really interesting to see again another example of perhaps cultural evolution. And rest is really important, right? I mean, like just like humans, all animals need some ability to recuperate. It's an important metabolic function. Um, and in New York City, one of the things that we were seeing initially were relatively lower numbers. And this is compared to our colleagues in the Northeast. We're talking, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, North. We're seeing hundreds of individuals haul out. Now, I should also make mention that primarily in New York City, we see harbor seals overwhelmingly, and gray seals, and occasionally we get a harbor hooded, which is a very sort of cold water seal, and they'll sort of wander down. Rare, super, super rare. Now, in and around New York City, we have a few locations in the five boroughs that we've been going to that have been fairly reliable. But as I said, since um, we had been working with another local organization, Gotham Whale, who had initiated some early counts of them. But I think when we sort of looked at our collective data, it was not plentiful, right? So one of the things we had suggested was that that is, the return of animals to New York City at the time was still relatively young. If you look at the historical records, they were well documented in sort of nature journals and literature, and then we're just kind of absent. Like you didn't really see much of it and mention in anything for a good part of the 20th century. So when we started doing our observations, and we again we're seeing relatively low numbers, and I'm going to say less than 20 each time. One of our primary locations, Hoffman and Swinburne Island, which is only accessible by boat, which is in again lower New York Bight. So for anybody that's familiar with their New York City geography, it's in between Brooklyn and Staten Island, just south of the Verrazanos Bridge. Again, only accessible by boat. There is also some wonderful history of the islands themselves and what they're used for. So I encourage people also to sort of look up to see them. Just a hint: quarantine people. That was what those islands were primarily used for. And but that had become a very desirable place for animals to haul out. So and I say this collectively, not myself, because in the last, I want to say 3 or 4 years. I'm just bad luck. Our students hate going out with me in particular because when I go out, my hit rate is pretty poor. Granted, like these observations, and I think much field work in the marine mammal world is opportunistic, right? I mean, field work, as you know, um, we're reliant on the animals to be present, and even though conditions might be great, near perfect, doesn't always guarantee, right, presence of animals. So that's been me for the last 3 or 4 years. But Christy BLC, when she goes out, I think to Swinburne Hoffman, I think they've seen upwards on 70, 80 individuals. And this is still a stark difference than our other land-based observations in around New York City. Um, we also started doing this work primarily from anecdotal reports. People were saying, again, we knew from, again, the literature record that they were here. Then we started hearing anecdotal stories that they were here. There is an ability for people to report sightings. Christy is responsible for liaising with NOAA and the DEC on reporting seal counts. So for anyone that does see them and cite them, you can look at the CSPEC website to report sightings. But back then, again, it was a lot more crude. And so we were chasing down anything. People would just call us or text us and email us and say, I've seen it. And say, okay, is that a reliable place? So we had gone all over the 5 boroughs chasing these things till we found, again, a few kind of reliable sites. But again, those numbers are still relatively small in comparison to what our colleagues see elsewhere. But that being said, the data that we have supports, again, a more stable seasonal population. We continue to kind of get anecdotal reports of people citing them up the Hudson River all the way to Albany, for example, which is kind of neat. And why not, right? But yeah, we really try to promote the message that just like other animals or backyard animals, I mean, for someone who lives in an urban environment, these are our backyard animals. There's, I think, a real bias, towards the eastern gray squirrel, European rock dove, pigeon. In those species, but again, are selected species and very, very well adapted to the urban environment. Here you had these species that had essentially been driven out, and we also speculate had a lot to do with various aspects of anthropogenic activity, pollution, waterway usage, decimation of habitat, decimation of food resources, and we know that's changing. changing enough. Again, one of the other challenges for them to contend with, sort of what was an absence in food resource, now that, there's probably something reliable, that again encourages them to stay seasonally. So it gives us, I think the bigger implications then is that it gives us a sense that New York City Harbor, which was known as one of the most polluted waterways in North America for a long time, is perhaps changing, right? That is, it's improving. So I hesitate sometimes to say, because it's a big claim, that that harbor seals may be a sentinel species. I've had this discussion with colleagues before. Um, I'd rather call them bioindicators of ecosystem health. It is because as mesopredators, they eat things and things eat them, right? And so their presence maybe suggests that the things under the sort of trophic food web are healthy enough to sustain them. That is, they're there to feed other things, right? And so that the quality of the urban, marine, ecological, sort of landscape must be better than it used to be.
Right. Well, and I mean, that's good news. And now
Mm-hmm.
I have so many more questions.
Sure.
But I do want to sort of define for the audience, our selected species just means those that have shorter, they make many more babies that don't take
Mhm.
years to develop and grow. And
Yeah.
so you can get higher numbers of them, and they may be able to
Yep.
deal with certain environmental challenges
Mhm.
differently than
Yeah.
other species like the seals. But it's
Mhm.
interesting. Okay, so there's got to be food for them, and
Mhm.
if the environment has improved enough to support enough food for them, you mentioned that they come back. So these are not sort of transient seals that wander accidentally into New York Harbor. They are coming
Mhm.
on purpose year after year.
Yeah. So, yep. Sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead. Go
No, no, no. Go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah. Did I get that
No.
wrong or?
No. You did. You got it right. So as I mentioned, we don't tag our seals. One of our questions is, and with our colleagues up north, are these the same seals, right? That us and our colleagues are seeing between the same sites. Are they the same seals returning year after year? Now, one of the other projects and I'm sure many other harbor seal researchers have is what I like to call a holy grail. It's basically sort of photo identification. Harbor seals are notoriously difficult to ID and ID well. We have a colleague, Dr. Artie Kopelman, who is the president of Cressley, which is a coastal research and ecology society of Long Island, who's been studying populations out east for 35 plus years, I want to say. And Artie is very good at identifying individuals from his population. And I'm not exactly sure how he does it, but a long time ago, someone had said to me, and this is, by the way, going to speak totally against, I think, things that you and I have been trained to think about. It's not to anthropomorphize, right? Not to give sort of human characteristics. But someone said to me at some point, if you treat these individuals like your friends, you begin to start identifying these small differences in between them. And and again, I don't know exactly what Artie is looking for, but he's very good at it. I have not quite gotten that refined yet, but it is one of our questions, right? Are
Yeah.
they the same individual? So not only are the same individuals coming back every season, but are they utilizing the different locations as well in between? And a reliable photo identification method would help us with that. We have ideas about how to do it. And this is, I'm not going to spill because this is chasing the Holy Grail. I'm not going to
Okay.
talk this one, but
All right.
we have
I
ideas
have a
about
suspicion.
yeah, but we have ideas how we're going to do it. But that would help us better understand, right? Sort of like like truly again, are they just the same individuals? Now, who were the first cohorts to come back? Again, because we hit up this population somewhere in the middle of this movement, right? So, who were the first cohorts to come back? Were they informing others? That is, was there recruitment, right? that, hey, this place is not half bad. It's better than it used to be, right? It's not like New York City in the 80s, right?
Or
It's
like
like,
we discovered someplace new.
yeah,
Nobody's ever been
yeah,
here before. There are no other
exactly.
seals there.
Exactly, right? I mean, because it's got to be like any early colonizers, right? There's always the potential threats for success, right? What's the likelihood you're going to be the first ones there and either want to stay there, not get killed, or what? Right? Like, it's you think about all
Pretty
these sort of
risky.
challenges, right? So it's very risky, right? Or bold, right? Depending on how you want to, like, call it. But you're right, very risky, very bold. The payoff worked, right, for them, and then we're starting to see that kind of recruitment because, as you know, again, now that they're also increasing numbers, right? I mean, then we get into sort of vigilance and so on, right? The safety in numbers thing. So, and that's some of the stuff that we're working on too. That's something we've had a couple students work on, the population that we're studying in New York City, also the population with Cressley. So, that's also become an interest that, right, that now we do have stable and or increasing numbers. How are they looking out for each other, right? And so because they're still not entirely devoid of threats and everything else, right? Just because they've landed in the spot, which seems great, right? Part of it, I guess, is innate, not to let your guard down, right? But the challenges for seals, right, is natural predators. Um, in more sort of recent human history or at human, right? Predators, right? So it's like they've got a lot to worry about. Sometimes I think, gosh, it's got to be really anxious to be a meso predator, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, so that's really interesting because okay, I don't anthropomorphize. I call it zoomorphizing people.
yeah,
Um,
sure,
so I'm gonna
yeah,
wander us a little bit into that direction
sure.
because I think for most people who have had any pets, they are very clear. There are individual differences. And it's interesting, there were a few prairie dogs, like I have my own thoughts about how to ID prairie dogs in a different way than tagging because it wasn't something I liked doing. But when you get to know individuals, they have quirks. They
Hmm.
have different behavior patterns that kind of give you some insight that oh, this is that one, especially for species where it might be difficult to tell individuals apart. Now
Hmm.
on mountain gorillas it still takes time to learn individuals, and a lot of times it's by nose print, but you got to be able to see that very clearly, and and so behavior and individuality is often a clue. There was one female who, when she vocalized, she sounded like she smoked like 3 packs of cigarettes. And I knew it was her. I mean, I didn't have to see her. It was just like, here's the smoker, oh my gosh. But her voice was so distinctive that
Was it a
that's
Mars
Buzitza.
Benson, right?
And
Yeah.
so have you noticed differences, even if you're not sure who's who, but among the seals when you're observing them, have you noticed differences in individual seals and how they, are some bolder or some more cautious, or is it, a little bit more nuanced than, I'm extremely bold and I'm extremely cautious? I mean, I think there are some overly anxious individuals, or as I like to say in gorillas, reactive, where the smallest thing can startle them. Like their startle response is vastly different than another one who just looks and, holds the food.
Mhm.
Okay. And,
Mhm.
and goes back to whatever they were doing. So
Yeah.
have you seen this? And is that something you can observe on haul out sites?
So it's a very good question. I don't think we have enough or the right kind of data. In part, our land-based locations are several hundred meters away, and then we're on a boat. I am notoriously bad at capturing video. We have tried, and not to say that's impossible, and we've thought of various variations, and it would be helpful in answering those kinds of questions. So some of the best information that we have on that are from our own observations at the Long Island Aquarium, as well as what other researchers do also with populations maintained under human care. Because then you can spend more time, albeit smaller sample sizes, right? But you can spend that time looking for those individual variations. Harbor seals are notoriously skittish, so the difficulty with studying those kinds of responses in the wild is most of them have a tendency to flee, right, if they are startled. And there is likely some kind of social, you know, communication aspect to it, where, you know, so I always give the example of, imagine you're walking down the street in Manhattan and you see someone staring up the Empire State Building. Everyone's going to look at that person, is probably going to feel inclined to stare up right at the top of the Empire State Building. So it's like social information, right? So it's, you know, there may not be anything up there, right? But you feel compelled by that gesture to mimic it. You don't even know what it is, right? You're just doing it. So you know, I think, you know, what I suspect is that a lot of that behavior, the fleeing, is triggered simply by social information. Hey, everyone's running, so I'm running too, right? I don't know what the problem is yet, but let's just go, right? It's, you know,
Yeah.
they must be doing the right thing. So that's why it's really hard to do that. And then other kinds of things, like how do we startle them? You know, and rightfully so, right? NOAA's got certain kind of permits of what you can and cannot do, you know, in the presence of marine mammals. And so to harass them is another permit. And we don't want to do that. You know, we've said, I mean, right, like that kind of response to startle them, right, would give us great data. But we also don't want to startle a population that may just be returning, right, to a historical location. So we don't want to scare them away from it again. You know, I think a lot of people have also had the misconception that when I say just because I work with marine mammals, I wrangle them, I hug them, and I do all sorts of things. Right? So they don't get the idea that no, we actually don't want to do a lot of those things, right? You know, we want to be, you know, relatively hands off. So we are thinking about how do we replicate that again in a sort of captive environment, right? And I'll say that deliberately, right? So can we do things like send drones up, you know, in the aquarium? Sure, right? And we can look at again how they might respond to that. Is it the sound? Is it the sight? How far? You know, and then we can kind of you know, we can kind of utilize a lot of other kinds of stimuli that they may attune to, and whether or not there's information from the others, are the others attuning to it as well, and so on. So that's why I said we don't really have like great information about it. Now, sea lions, on the other hand, are a lot better at habituating. So I also give the example of like the sea lions out in San Francisco, Fisherman's Wharf, right? Like or Monterey, right? Like you literally go out there and they're just lying out there, not bothered by the hundreds of people that are surrounding them, you know. So they have made, right, instead of talking about cognition, right, they sort of made the decision, right, that while there's been a human history of hunting and so on, that the audience is really there to watch them, and there's no interaction. So they've determined that most of the observers are non-threatening. So it's sort of again interesting and how different pinniped species too would make that decision, and how much information did they get to make those sorts of decisions. So
well, yeah, and it's interesting, right? I definitely, we don't deliberately startle mountain gorillas, but these are mountain gorillas that are habituated for tourism, and yet there are small things like all tourists can't carry a walking stick in the presence of gorillas because historically they were hunted with spears. And so, and sticks look like spears, right? So they behave very differently if you start pounding stick up and down. They you know, which nobody does, right? But they would. And you know, my accidental startle of this very reactive silverback was like I sneezed, you know, and it and that was it. That's all it took, was a sneeze to garner a very strong response. Whereas others, you know, if you fall, it might startle and they might react, stand up and screaming,
Mhm.
but then they realize it's you. Like
Yeah.
there's an individual recognition of like,
Mhm.
okay, it's just you. It's fine,
Mhm.
and so I think that what's really interesting too is it is true with the sea lions that up to a point they are non-reactive,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
there are violations, right? And even
Mhm.
habituated animals that people can do either inadvertently or deliberately
Yeah.
that cause problems. And we're almost out of time. And I know we could keep talking all
Sure.
afternoon probably, but I just kind of want to get your take, thinking about this, thinking about how other
Mhm.
animals get used to people and how that can either make them less reactive or sometimes more reactive. We've seen orcas off the coast of Spain
Mhm.
interacting and ramming, sometimes sinking a few boats. There's been a lot of
Mhm.
speculation about this. And then
Mhm.
there's this sea otter in California who
Mhm.
has been, let's say, aggressively borrowing surfboards.
Mhm.
And, I think sometimes when the general public hears about these things, like with this sea otter, they might think, oh, that's so cute. Well, they're stealing, they
Yeah.
want us to go surfing. Um,
Mhm.
Less probably thinking it's cute for orcas to be ramming boats, but I think it deserves a more interesting answer than people might expect. Why do you think some of these behaviors are happening? And do you think it's related to this sort of pressure from humans in their environments?
Yeah, I think there's been a long fascination with sort of the human animal interaction, right? Sort of, The Little Mermaid, right? Hans Christian Andersen, for example, or Clever Hans, the roadshow horse that could do basic math, right? So there's always been this sort of again, these sort of little things that people thought and that people thought that there was some kind of connection, if you will, between humans and animals. And by the way, I'm not going to doubt that, right? Because it's not something I also study or fully understand. But every time there's a positive interaction, right, it's almost sort of reinforces this false sense that all animals, right, are going to be friendly and so on until they aren't. Um, some really cool examples. Like in New Zealand, there was Pelorus Jack, which is a Rizzo's dolphin that used to help ferry the inter-island, ferry from the North to South Island. So they use it as a guide, particularly when it was foggy or difficult. Oppo the dolphin off Opanoni used to allow people to hang on to its dorsal fin as it, went swimming and so on. So um, and and these sorts of things again, I think just speak to there is and there can be some positive interactions. Um, but there's a choice, right? And this is where as scientists, it's really it's the challenge to try to understand how and why they might be choosing to have positive interactions with humans versus as you mentioned, like things like threat. Are they feeling these interactions again threatening? Are they behaving in ways that are response to things like encroachment? Or are they perceiving infringement on other aspects? We from our colleagues up north, for example, that have to work with fisheries a lot, a lot. And we hear this across a lot of species, not just seals, but things like sharks, right? And particularly post Jaws kind of years. But the fisheries in the Northeast Atlantic, they have a real problem with seals getting into things like fish pots and lobster pots and so on. And so their initial perception is that they're just these annoying pests. Where if you think about it from a seal's perspective, you're like, whoa, there's 10 lobsters in a pot. It's a buffet, right? It's
Perfect.
why would I want to go in there, right?
Of course. Of
And
course.
so it's this very difficult balance because a lot of times these things might encroach on humans sort of like livelihood, right? Whether it not just recreationally, but sort of financially, right? If you are a farmer, right, in the Midwest, and you have coyotes and gray wolves descending upon your livestock, if you are a lobster person and you have seals tearing into your trail, I can understand how that's just very destructive, right, in many ways. But it's difficult to sort of fault, right, an animal for doing, I think, mostly what they need to do to survive. We're creating conditions that might really attract them, right? And again, it's, we're thinking about it in a very different way, and animals are thinking about these situations differently as well. Um, you know, I would say that, from all the sort of negative interactions outside, outside of any sort of misconceptions about, you know, how I guess I'm struggling to find the right words, but they're not doing it, I think, necessarily, and partly why it doesn't happen often, right? It's not, I think, it's not a constant behavior, right? So you don't see orcas around the world constantly attacking humans, right? You don't see interactions of animals constantly attacking humans. A lot of it's defensive, right? And they're either protecting themselves, again, resources, young or whatever. And if you sort of had to put yourself in that kind of perspective, I think we would do the same, in a lot of ways, right? Um, right? We just
Yeah.
have this bias. We've always just had this bias that humans are the pinnacle species on this earth, right? And so that
Yeah.
everything else is,
Yeah.
you know,
Or human
so
exceptionalism, right? Where like it's a bad sea otter for what it's doing. It's a mean sea
yep,
otter.
yep, yep.
Honestly, if you know sea otters very well, they're not that nice. Like in general,
No, they're
like their
not.
temperament is not, they look so cute. They do.
Oh, they're
And we
vicious.
are, they are exactly.
Yep.
And we are
I tell
just
everyone
sort
they're
of,
vicious.
yeah, we're
Yeah.
wired, right? The big eyes, the fluffy,
Mhm.
appearance gives our brain says, oh, it's so cute. And this is something, I find interesting. Like you, I'm sure I love and respect other animals.
Mhm.
I have no desire to be in physical contact with
Mm.
wild animals at all. And so the
Yeah.
last question,
Okay.
for someone listening who's never
Mhm.
really thought about, animal behavior or animal cognition or personality, and and they may have different views of things like squirrels and pigeons. What's one thing that you feel like they could start noticing that would change how they see the animals around them, in the sense that seeing them as the individual, like, species trying to make their own living in the world, and respecting them and their space and their tasks, just like we want to be
Mhm.
able to go to work and go to the store and cook our dinner in peace without threat. What's something that the average person can just start to notice about other animals?
Yeah. So, are you sure we don't have time for a part two? Because I think I'm about to roll with 45 minutes with this question. I'm
Oh
kidding.
man. Okay, we did
I'm kidding.
part
I'm
two.
kidding. I'm
We'll have a
kidding.
part two.
I'm kidding. So let's see. Okay, I'll answer. Okay, I will answer it in two ways. By the way, and I know that we communicate a lot on the side about, sort of institutional stuff, and I never answer a question always straightforward if you haven't figured that out. But this is a nod, and I'll say this here. It's a nod to a good friend and former Sunni Empire colleague, Alan Mandel, who would have at least 2 points plus every time he answered a question. But I will answer it in two ways that I think are important. Um, when I teach animal behavior right now, we do, very, very, very basic kind of ad libitum, ethogram, and then I'll have them do time budgets and so on. And then I'll have them continue to do it for different species. Um, and I often have them select animals of convenience, in part because I don't want people going out and committing to care for an animal that they're unable to do so, right? I mean, some always wanted that puppy, I'm like, this is not the time to do that, right? It's like, if you want, here's what you're up against, right? But, so I get people that are, just like, oh, I've had my dog, for like 8 years. I know everything I know about this dog. I say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to like scale all that back. And literally all you're going to do, again, a naturalistic observation style, hands off, just watch it, and I guarantee you're going to start noticing things. Like, we tend to pick up on the obvious stuff, right? I want them to pay attention to the little things. Like, I'll ask some stupid, like, is your dog right-handed or left-handed? Oh, I don't know, even though you've known for 8 years. Well, I said, well, here you go, right? Like,
Yeah.
and you might not think it's important, but these are the things that help them. And I get to those are quite typic stuff, right? So they're just like, again, more physical, but that's a gateway into also understanding the nuances of individual personality too, I think. And then also getting people to think, this is partly in my own training. Yes, a lot of people give emotion to their animals, and I hate breaking that, right? I'm sure they swear that's how they're, particularly when it's their own pets, that's how they're feeling, right? And I hate breaking that, but I wanted to take kind of a half step back, and it's like, are we really sure that they're quote unquote happy, sad, or whatever? How do we reframe it into things that we can measure, test, and then lead on to maybe things that are actually emotional? Like, is there a preference? Is there some kind of contentness? We talked about bold, risky, yeah, those sorts of things, which then help them to think about being a scientist, and then help them to think about what they used to think about in a different lens, right? So mostly for me, it's just like, it's really just sort of a stop, right? You got to just stop and just take more time to watch the natural world, right? And
Yeah.
the benefit of being in a class is I'm forcing my students to do it, right? So it's hard to say for like somebody who's like, just not, like, I'll even say watch nature doc. I mean, really anything you can do is still better than nothing.
Yeah.
Um, and so the other story that I have, and this is more for people who are, I think, really interested in wanting to study the field of animal behavior. And there are all sorts of occupations, right, where it's important. Aspects of veterinary sciences, vet techs. If you're planning not just to be in the veterinary sciences and working for, say, a large organization or starting your own business, if you want to do animal husbandry and welfare, right, like you're working in a zoo or an aquarium, possibly, starting your own consultation, like behavioral modification business. I've met a few students who do that, um, that's all great. But then, if I ever get students like, well, they see what we do. And again, I count my lucky stars every day that I'm gainfully employed, because my shtick is animal behavior as a profession is freakishly harsh, right? It's like, yeah, I say, you want to talk about what is the most unemployable of all biological subdisciplines? I was like, how did I come from like New York City to doing this? Like, where again, my parents were like haters of animals and stuff, and I also say that in the kindest way. But here's my story. So my story is this. I first asked them if anybody if they've seen the movie Godzilla. Now I can't remember which Godzilla is because they all start blending together. It's one of the newer ones, but it's the one with the Stranger Things kid. And anyways, her dad is the scientist. So they got Godzilla, they've got him all tied down, and they're trying to figure out like what he wants and what he's doing here. They have all these scientists they could ask, biophysicists, right? Geneticists, and so they have all these other scientists that they could ask. You know who they call? I don't know. Do you know, Jennifer? Do you
No,
remember who
I've
they
never
call?
seen the movie, but I'm hoping it's
Oh,
animal behaviorist.
that's who they call. They call an animal behaviorist. Why? Because they want somebody who might help them figure out what he wants by his expertise in communication. I thought I had missed my calling because
Right?
until the next great, like, intergalactic beast descends onto our planet, I'm thankful to be employed. But I tell them, I say, look, and it's not about. It really isn't about. I think for me, actually, at the end of the day, it's not about animal. I am interested in questions about the natural world, but I do think it's about understanding the scientific process more than anything else. Right. I don't care what question is. I don't care what discipline, natural, social sciences. How do we follow scientific? It helps me decipher, garbage in the news, right? From like real world stuff, right? Helps me make more informed decisions, helps me understand statistics a little more. So that's the part of it. You can be more interested in animal behavior, but it's about sort of having wider applications, right? In terms of the scientific method. So
yeah. Well, given how hard it is to be employed, I feel very, very grateful that now SUNY Empire has 2 animal behaviorists in their ranks.
Mhm.
And I'm so grateful for your time on the show, and also thrilled that I get to work with you in teaching and in research. And so thank you so much, Kevin.
Yeah, no worries. Then thank you for having me. And we are thankful to have you at SUNY Empire.
Okay, Kevin and I could have continued since cognition is such a fascinating topic. What his work is showing is that seals coming back to New York Harbor isn't just a cute headline. It's a sign that places, when given the chance to recover, can welcome back species that used to call it home. The next time you see a squirrel, a pigeon, or anything you've written off as just background noise in your neighborhood, take Kevin's advice. Stop, watch, and notice the little things. That individual is making decisions, navigating risk, and trying to live a life just like we are. Speaking of animals navigating cities, in the next episode, I'm talking with Dr. Chris Schell about urban wildlife, how coyotes, raccoons, and other city dwellers are adapting to us, and what that says about resilience, evolution, and environmental justice. If you've enjoyed today's conversation about marine mammals learning to live around us, you're going to like that one too. I also want to give you a heads up that I'm heading back to the field in the next few weeks, so expect some fresh gorilla stories to make their way into future episodes. The mountain gorillas always have something new to teach me. And finally, mark your calendars. I'm going to be putting together a special series celebrating Freedom 250, wildlife, and American values. More details are coming soon, but I promise it's going to be a series unlike anything we've ever done before on this show. Stay tuned, subscribe so you don't miss it, and as always, thanks for listening.